My name is Brooke Lifeso, and I'm the Justice Artistic Director at Robertson Wesley United Church as part of the Spirited Arts Movement. And this is part 2 of Seeds of Change. And just to remind people of how this started is Reverend Karen Bridges asked me to do a video series on just where we're at in the world and kind of sharing some ways to process and to have a more nuanced understanding of what's going on. And kind of what I'll say about what's going on is the COVID pandemic. How are we together in society in that? And also Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd protests, police brutality, defunding the police in America, North America, globally. And of course that coincides with ongoing conflicts and ongoing cultural aspects of things such as climate change and globalization and the 1% and the things that have really are crystallizing in the 21st century. So the first session, just to recap what we talked about, we looked at some images of the day and talked about how they resonate with us and how we shift in them. And then we also spoke about levels of conflict. So personal versus structural, where we sit in that. You're a person, but you exist in a society. And then the levels of conflict we're going to have. The material, the stuff, oil, water, air, money, interpersonal, between two people or between two cultures or two nations, and then symbolic. So the culture that we exist in and what does that ask for us? And that conflict exists in all three, and certain cultures, particularly European cultures, don't always acknowledge the spiritual aspect, particularly in North America. And kind of the theory around that, which comes from the Pillay and LeBaron, is that if you're not addressing symbolic conflict, you can't solve conflicts. And a really strong Canadian example of this is Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the colonial government with the Indigenous First Nations and reserve system, and how that is a symbolic conflict that can't only be solved through money or through being good or nice people. And racism in North America would be the same thing. So that's a review of part 1. So welcome to today. Today is part 2 of perhaps many parts that is remain to be seen. But the first thing I wanted us all to do is to get into our bodies. It's 9 a.m. Maybe you've been up for 3 hours, maybe you just rolled out of bed, I'm not sure. But if you can just move your body in your chair, you can stand up, just see kind of where things sit. And yeah, just move your body. What isn't moving at all? What feels maybe too loose, which isn't an issue for me, but maybe it is for you. What feels way too tight? What kind of cramps up for you? And if you want to, you can put on some music of your choice. I won't torture you with my music. And just move around. Now I want you to be aware of what maybe your body might need. It's 9 a.m. Have you drank any water yet? Do you need some coffee because that's part of your morning ritual? What about food? And I want you to take a moment and just check in with what does your body need? And I'm gonna drink a bit of water. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm talking about bodies. Well, so far in talking about conflicts, we've talked a lot about our brain, our head, which is also a very Western, some would say masculine or patriarchal view of conflict. And so today we're going to talk about other ways of knowing, which are really, really important when we talk about conflict, and cultural understandings of conflict as well. So I just wanted us to be in our body, and the first question I'm going to ask you today is, when you feel Well, first of all, the question I'd like to ask is, when you're moving around, where do you have tension in your body? And where does tension typically sit? So I'm just going to write that in the comments because I want us to keep coming back to that question today. And when you're in conflict, where does that sit in your body? And the other thing we really have to be mindful of too is when we experience joy, where does that sit in our body? So last time we really talked about theories and concepts of conflict. Neck and back. So this area, and this is where I hold tension as well. And I think what's important to note is this interesting thing where we can get into, well, there's tension there, but also we exist in the world. So are you sitting in a proper chair all the time when you work from home now? Is your mattress supportive enough? And all these things exist in conflict as well, and are metaphors, but actually literal as well. How can we support our bodies while we move through the world? Yeah, gut and throat for conflict is what Pan's saying. So we're going to come back and talk about bodies, but the first thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is really important, and I'll just ask, do folks know about anti-oppression or intersectionality? Is this something that people know about? And if you can just comment, and I'm going to write that question here, so because yes, joy in the chest. So it's really easy to find conflict in our bodies because our bodies become, well, mine does, really reactive. But joy is also something to monitor. Where does joy sit in your body? So we're going to come back to the talking about our bodies at the end, but I first just wanted to have a lecture component, if you will, where great. So Pan is familiar with intersectionality and oppression, and this is where, if we were in a space together as humans, we would do some exercises around it. But I just wanted to give a brass tacks about it because I think it's important, especially right now where the world is, that we understand it's a huge way the culture is reading it, and particularly to use these frameworks, the left or the NDP, or that the liberal is using intersectionality to talk about where money should go, about oppression, and about society. And I do see a divide where more conservative, Fox News, Conservative Member Party of Canada, North American context I'm using, isn't using that or directly critiquing it. So I thought it was important just to get people on the same page and be really basic. So we, as I mentioned before, live in a society, and we have parts of ourselves that are largely out of our control. They're what we were born into. So I mentioned before that I'm a white settler. I have white skin. I also have a gender, and I speak English, and all these things. And what exists is a dominant culture, and then things that don't fit the dominant culture. And the dominant culture is what exists in building policies and rules and cultural understandings. So it's really important to know with intersectionality that it is baked into policy. It is the government of Canada. It is the American Constitution. That is a dominant culture. And when it was created, the constitutions, it was understanding who they were written by and who they were benefiting. And you can really see this in America, that their constitution is entirely using the word freedom. But in that context, they were talking about freedom from British colonial rule. They weren't talking about freedom for every human that was on their land. And so something like the American Constitution has oppression baked into it because of who they viewed as important, as valuable, as a citizen at that time that had rights. And what this has done is created a world, mainly it's due to colonialism and Europeans moving across the world, and then the slave trade and moving people and ranking them, that has created intersectionality, particularly with race. However, there's many ways that the dominant culture exists. So if we look at the American Constitution, it was written by rich old white dudes who owned slaves. So we have a gender, a sexual orientation, an ethnic group, a language, the religion that they were, and North America is based off that. So it's based off of being Christian, being English-speaking Anglo in the West, being a man, and being white from a European background. And there's so much more to this too. There's urban, there's education, and so what anti-oppression or intersectionality is saying, the theory is that you can't fight for only one marginalization. So I can't only be a feminist who only cares about uplifting cis white women. And the other place I see this in my other work is disability. So I can fight the patriarchy, but what I also need to fight for is disability justice, for rural voices to be taken seriously, for different races to really decolonize. Class is a huge one, in education as well. So how can we assist people who live in rural spaces or inner city spaces that don't typically have institutional power? And this is an interesting thing to lecture because it's best seen, in my opinion, through talking about ways that people are oppressed or experience privilege. So this is a huge place where you hear people talk about white privilege or male privilege or able-bodied privilege. So what that means is that you have been born through often no fault or blame of your own. You've been born into a dominant culture where the culture exists. You just know it. You were born into it. And you may not be aware that your life is easier because of that. And this is a huge thing and gets back to that personal and structural. The other, so I just want to say quickly, and I got this from Open Text BC, personal oppression. So this is things that personally happen to you. These are comments that are made. These are things that are harder for you. So I'm going to use one for myself. As a disabled woman, it's very hard for me to get life insurance. And it's very hard for me to get around a city that's so car focused. So those are personal oppressions that I experience. A cultural oppression is something that exists. It's like the air that we breathe. So in Canada, the fact that we celebrate and get a week off for Christmas, but we don't get time off for Ramadan is an oppression, that our culture is based around Christian holidays. Culturally, to use the disability model, that we exist in a space where it's okay to tell someone, have you ever tried yoga, when they tell you they have a medical diagnosis, or that we look to cure people would be a cultural oppression. So if your body's different, we should cure that. That's oppressive. And the other one, which is really huge and kind of where I've been speaking about, is systemic or structural oppression. So the example that I used, for instance, is disability, that people who are disabled face greater unemployment, are unable to receive medical insurance, unable to receive housing, the fact that we build so many houses with stairs, that elevators aren't commonplace, that there isn't curb cuts. Those are structural oppressions, because we have decided to build things to a dominant culture that you can go upstairs. And what that does is that excludes people and creates a different world and a different flattening for those people. So I thought this was really important to just talk out. And I'm not an expert at this. There's loads you can read online about it. It comes from Black feminism in the 80s and 90s. And what it was seeing was that feminism did make gains, but not for women of color because of these other oppressions. And so that we needed to look at things. And I always think about it as a grid. So I can't just fight for disability. I can't just fight for feminism. An injury to one is an injury to all. So if we're looking at uplifting folks, we have to look at all these different things. And what this plays into, and why I mention it and think it's so important, is that the dominant culture now, we're seeing that they feel attacked, and particularly white dudes feel attacked. And that is one critique of this theory, is that if you are completely of the dominant culture, so you're able-bodied, you're Christian, you're English, you're a cis man, you don't experience marginalization. And cis men are saying, well, actually I do. I don't feel well, I don't feel heard, I don't feel understood. And what I say to that is the system is oppressing, it's narrowing you too, but you still have institutional privilege. You still can get into rooms and people still take you seriously in a way that they don't a woman of color, solely because of your social location, who you are without being asked to be that. So I thought this was really key in looking at the world today, because there is certain people, and I'm one of them. I was taught this theory, and it's really a lens. It's like putting on your glasses, and once you see it everywhere. So you see, one that I've been speaking about lately is the pay gap. So on average, white men in Alberta make $70,000 a year on average. And I could pull up the exact stats, but just speaking off the cuff, and the Canadian average is $53,000. And the average for women, I believe, is like $45,000. Why do men get paid so much more? The jobs that they're in are valued more. And this was white men get paid more than anyone else in the country. And again, it's not individual men, but it's like looking at a very broad, it's like we're eagles. And we live in a society that pays men more money, despite their education, despite many things. It's because the things they get into, we deem more worthy. They negotiate stronger for their wage, and they get to be told yes. And so that's the cultural and systemic oppression. So that's kind of, I just wanted to throw that out there. And you can read loads about that. But once you kind of know that lens, you can see where people are talking about. And you can also kind of talk about the counter agreement. So the backlash to intersectionality is that, like, hey, I might be white, but my life sucks. It's like you still experience the gains of being white in North America. So that's all I want to say about that, just to get that like cooking and bubbling. And I welcome any comments, any emails about that theory. And I can send and find like quizzes or easy ways to get at it, because it's a very large theory. And I've seen it have a mainstream creep, and be everywhere, and not just in universities. Yes, Pan mentioned the expectation that they're providing for a wife and kids is a big one, and exists in a way that is like baked into the patriarchy. So men ask for more, and there's an understanding that they're the provider of their family, but then they become the provider of their family, and women are expected to stay at home with their kids. And you see that it's a great example of structural or systemic oppression. So we don't have childcare, universal childcare in Alberta anymore. So women are seen, or a family decides, well, who makes more money? And that person goes to work and the other person stays at home. That's a structural oppression. And it becomes really complicated. And I want to say that everyone experiences, like, the different oppressions and marginalizations that people experience can really shift. And it takes some time. I found with this, it's easy to see the ways that you're marginalized. That's a way into the theory, and can really help you. For me, it really blew my mind when I first saw it. Things that I thought were personal, aren't. And then you have to look at the ways that you also experience privilege from it, which is harder. But it's a journey, and it's a journey I feel like the news and media are on right now, is how to address that. So I'm just gonna let a little bit of time for any like questions or comments about that pop up, because there's a bit of a delay on here. Okay, if there is comments about that, please feel free to email me after the fact, or message me. I'm really happy to chew on that, because typically that's something that is taught in like a 2-hour workshop, where we really do unpack what are the ways that society is built for me, and which ways is it not. So I want to go back again to our bodies and kind of moving them as we're in them, and all the screen world as well. We exist in screens now, in makeshift offices in our house. And people might have kids and yelling things. I also want to get us into our senses, which is a way that we experience our body as well. So our eyes are a big one for most people. Kind of move your eyes around. What are you hearing right now? Are you smelling anything? Yeah, we could. Is someone in your house making coffee? Did you just cook yourself some breakfast? What are you smelling? We always forget smell. And taste. What are you tasting? You're in your house, so you can, or someplace else. So I just had some cold brew coffee. I'm tasting it in my mouth. So what we've been talking about are theories that people have observed in the world and then wrote about and wrote papers about and exist in academia and then became mainstream and are chewed on in forums and things like that. But that's very in our heads. And believe me, I love a good head conversation. I do really love the kind of theories of that. But Le Baron wrote this great book called The Bridge Over Troubled Water, I believe. And it's talking about other ways of knowing. And I think this is huge when we look at conflict, and gets into intersectionality and culture as well. But so I just kind of want to talk about the different ways of knowing, and then maybe we'll dance a bit or talk more about our bodies and metaphor. So the first way that we know is in our head, making those connections intellectually. And not the first way, that's one way we know. The other is somatic, is the fancy word. So being in your body. So where does conflict sit in your body? Where does stress? So neck and shoulders was mentioned. Gut and throat when you're in conflict. Maybe it exists in the flushing of your cheeks. It could exist, but it's really important to clock that we are bodies. We are humans who aren't just minds in meat machines. I mean, that can be a philosophy, and I'm happy to sit in a park and talk about that, but we exist in bodies. So when we're in conflict in a body. And the other, which is really key in conflict, I find, is emotions. So I mean, how many of you have been in a conflict with someone and gotten emotional? I know I have. I'm not just a logical brain going through emotion. So another way of knowing is our emotional intelligence, being connected and staying curious and getting beyond the frozen memories in our brain and our tears or our anger, our facial expressions, all the emotions that come up. And something that the Haven Institute taught me a few years ago too, which is important, is feelings versus emotions. So the feelings, the somatic, pulling, cold, detached, versus emotions, sad, happy, angry. And Yeah, so you're angry about something, you're sad about something, and that has a way of knowing, and that has a way of wisdom. The other one that LeBaron speaks about in her book is connected or spiritual, which I thought was really important with Robertson Wesley. And I'm just going to quote her. So we recognize our purposes and ways of meaning making and their effects in our work. And we respect the ways that purpose and meaning making compromise others' identities. So the spiritual self recognizes a bigger picture connectedness. And we recognize that we're connected in multiple ways and meanings. And due to this interconnectedness, we can't dispose of conflict. It's not an us and a them, it's all relational and interdependence. And so for her, spiritual knowing is recognizing the connection between ourselves and the outside world. And it's asking for gracefulness and gratitude and gentleness and groundedness. So yeah, emotional every time. So with spiritualness, and maybe it's recognizing that we're all interconnected, and that deep empathy, and that it's not just divisions. And this is really key as well. So these are the ways of knowing. It's not just in our mind. And kind of, I'd love us to share stories about where we have felt this and experienced this. So maybe a story of being emotional or feeling it in your body. And I'll just wait for the comments to come up. Yeah. And I'll write them down too. So the ways of knowing. These are all connected with culture as well. So I don't know about other people, but I definitely grew up with this understanding that the way to succeed in a conflict was to be non-emotional and very logical and express your thoughts and be direct. And all of these are cultural understandings. There's no right or wrong way to deal with conflict. They're just different ways of dealing. Some escalate a conflict and some de-escalate a conflict. But I think it's important to look at what you see as bad. So what's a bad way of dealing with conflict and what's a good way of dealing with conflict, and where does that come from? So being non-emotional in a conflict is just a cultural preference. It's a cultural preference. Does that mean that we should yell at people? It probably escalates the situation. So I'd like you to share, and I'm putting it in the comments. So I'm curious to know your stories about these other ways of knowing, because I think it's really important to share and get kind of beyond what I mentioned. Just thinking that conflicts are solved in our heads, because we can see that not working. We can see when someone is really, well, I'm going to use an example, the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests in the States. Black Americans are angry and grieving and are expressing that by being angry, by, not all of them, but in the protests and what we see in the media, by shouting, by taking to the streets, by crying, by congregating. And so by just saying, well, they should get over it, or I don't know why they're so upset, whatever people might be saying, they're totally negating this other way of knowing, which is being sad and recognizing the interconnectedness. So yeah, it's really important to look at the ways that we all negate certain ways of knowing how to move forward or certain experiences because we think that conflicts can be solved with ideas and in our heads. So I would love to know a story of another way of knowing, observing a conflict, being in conflict, even solving a conflict with these other ways of knowing. So Pat is just sharing, which I'll read out loud if that's okay, that they would get teased by family members and not in a fun way, very body-based, and that they would choke up, throat would close, and stop breathing to stop from crying, then would leave and go to the bedroom to actually cry. Thank you very much for sharing that. Are you okay if I kind of speak about the ways of knowing and ways that you protected yourself in a very light way? I'll just wait for an emoji or something. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's a sensitivity that's needed, and a sensitivity that's needed to our bodies and other people's bodies that doesn't discount how we know and how we protect ourselves. And a big thing that I take from Pan's story, which I'm so grateful you shared, thank you, Pan, is that your body protected you, and you were your body protected you, but also you were in a culture where it wasn't okay to express vulnerability in your emotions. And we haven't talked about vulnerability at all because that's a giant topic. But really, if we're looking at conflict in ourselves, with other people, and the world, there needs to be an aspect of imagination and vulnerability to move forward. And I definitely grew up in a culture where an emotional outlet for conflict or vulnerability wasn't allowed, it wasn't condoned. So to stop crying, especially because that would be used against you, and then how to be in our bodies, because on paper or in our heads, something can be a very good idea, or be, we said sorry, we're fine, and move on. And that gets to the symbolic and interrelational. Just because you have a level-headed conversation about something being okay, that conflict can still exist in our bodies and spiritually, and not just be an idea. It's something that needs to be sat with and honored in kind of an imagination to move forward. And yeah, accessing our feelings and our knowledge and knowing that other people are doing the same thing is that spiritual connection. And then how can we move forward from that? And so much of this is based in culture too. And I'll speak mainly to my own, like this direct but not too direct, non-emotional way of speaking and moving through in the world. And it negates when someone's really raging then we want to discredit them because they were mad. But that rage and that grief need space, or else you're always just trying to navigate conflict on a very surface level. So how can you tap into it and honor it while also not getting stuck then in feelings or emotions and not moving forward? And just to bring this back, so all these ways of knowing exist on a personal level, so maybe conflicts you have with yourself, structural, the in-between, and then also a lot of this is getting at the interrelational and symbolic levels of conflict, and could even be there to address really complex, big problems like poverty. Like poverty makes people sad and angry and depressed, and is something that is experienced personally between two people and then structurally. And so it's really important. And I just want us to take a moment and stretch again as we talk about this and check in about where this conflict fits in our body. So for me, I'm feeling it a bit in just my diaphragm. And I'm hoping that I'm addressing this well and slowly and not repeating myself too much, but just enough to understand. It's also possible too, and LeBaron speaks about this, that if you're looking at these other ways of knowing, these other ways of wisdom, you don't actually have to speak the same language. You can solve conflict by dance. You can have people together in a room and never talk, but find a way to relate to each other that isn't idea-based. And Panish was explaining another experience of conflict, which is to only respond with anger and profanity and rage outbursts. So this also gets at accountability and violence as well. So by lashing out at people with your emotions and never wanting to address them is not accountable and won't solve conflicts. And it does viscerally be felt by other people. So maybe if we do a third part, we can talk about accountability, which is huge and something I'm definitely still figuring out. So if we're looking at conflict, breathing. I forgot about breathing. Breathing is huge, huge, huge. And we can talk about breathing in a whole bunch of ways. It's used in religious practices and yoga for good reason. If you're stretching and you're not breathing, that's not good for your body. It's used in conflict and different types of psychotherapy. But it's also scientifically, when you breathe, nice deep breaths, you're accessing your nervous system and the vagus nerve. And you're telling your body to calm down and readdress. The other thing it does too, which is why it works for meditation, is it gets you in the moment that you're in. And you can add another sense to it as well, like what am I hearing? What am I tasting as I'm breathing? And it reconnects you with your body. So if you find yourself holding your breath, see if you can breathe a little bit deeper and connect back. Yes, we will do a third part on accountability, which I'm so very, very much learning about. So maybe that one we can do by Zoom or another way to interact. because right now I'm giving theory. Yeah. So these different ways of knowing, and I think I'd want to end our time today talking and getting us to where joy might reside, and ways of working through conflict without talking. And I know that Michelle LeBaron did a dance session with people from Israel and people from Palestine, and they danced together. And I think that is a literal and beautiful metaphor for how we might be able to move forward. But what are some other metaphors that people see for the world's current concerns? Because metaphor also allows us to speak about things and access our imagination without always speaking so directly. So metaphor is a way to get another way of knowing, another way of accessing our creative imagination. So I see the world as a crumpled piece of paper. I see the world as, oh, hello, Anna. Yes, crying is a way, something that helps me with crying, I'm a crier, is that it's a way of your body giving you endorphins and releasing stress. And therefore, and also it doesn't mean that you have to do anything with your tears, but it is a physiological response to allow you to relieve stress and have that vulnerability. So back to our breath. And I'm just gonna put some comments in. So I wanted us to end today to kind of think about metaphor, because it's also a way of accessing our imagination and getting around stuck ways. And if we were together, we'd probably create some art, and I might look at how to create art with you the next time we meet. But for right now, if the world concerns could be described by metaphor, what would that metaphor be? And I'd love to read your metaphors. Zoom? Like the platform, the software platform? Or like the sound? A blank mind is an excellent metaphor. I'm not sure the current conflicts in our world, I mean, maybe a good example to kind of bring things back is climate change. So climate change we've been trying to solve in a very materialistic way, through money, through accords, through nation states, and it hasn't been working. Because it's not looking at the symbolic aspect of the limitations. So just one country can't solve climate change. just one company can't solve climate change, the fact that there's a huge barrier of people who are actively benefiting from not signing Kyoto or Paris Accords. And so the traditional ways of solving that conflict are not working because it's a huge global catastrophe that's looming. That's here. It's here already. So with climate change, we really need to access a spiritual connectedness that already is well founded in Cree and Indigenous theories in the world, and have a completely new, different way of looking at a conflict, and how to solve it through imagination and embodiment and that spiritual intelligence with climate change. So that is just kind of coming back, and that we exist as individuals with climate change. Oh, you did a workshop via Zoom. Yes, we will. Okay, great. Then I will talk to Karen about Zooming this next time so we can see each other's faces. So for me, climate change is an excellent example of how we need to shift how we find solutions, are solutions possible, and getting us beyond a nation state to, I've used a lot of big words, but I see capitalism as the problem with climate change, neoliberalism, globalization. So how do we find a new solution? And things are happening. They are. That doesn't use these old models for climate change. And I see that in all conflicts, but that one is particularly strong. So, if the world's concerns could be described by metaphor, what would that metaphor be? I'll give you a bit more time and then... That's okay. I'll read Anna's. A dirty pond, bad for the environment, not great to look at, putting lives at risk, but also something that can be fixed and has a lot of potential for a better future. Thank you. Yeah, so this is a great way, if you ask someone for a metaphor, then teach you my tricks of the trade. I asked them questions about that metaphor in the hopes that that would turn up new solutions. So what I'd love to ask for now is, like, how do you fix a dirty pond? How big is a pond? When does a pond become a lake, or when is a pond a puddle? And yeah, what would be a first step to fixing a dirty pond? So I want to spend just our last few minutes together, being back in our bodies. So right now I'm scratching a mosquito bite, which I shouldn't be doing, but where is tension? I'm trying to work through some of that tension. Remembering to breathe. Oh. And if you can, I'm going to do it today because I'm out of practice. Put on a song that you like to dance to and move your body around a little bit. You don't have to dance really well, but just to move your body and remember that you have one in these days of screens. And yeah, and I won't tell you how to move your body. You can move your body how you like, but oh, it feels good. So there's some conversation in fixing the dirty pond. So don't add new pollutants would be assessing the issue and looking at ways other people have solved. Indigenous knowledge is, yeah, that's huge to tap into, and what's the traditional knowledge of fixing dirty ponds, which maybe is a place we can start next time. I find metaphor too, you can get really literal with talking about metaphor. So exactly like Anna is saying, like look up ways that dirty ponds are solved on the internet. And then does that metaphor apply or relate? And it probably does. Metaphor is an amazing way to talk about conflict. So another big stretch, and another big breath. And taking in what our eyes are seeing, and our mouth is tasting, and our ears are hearing. And our interconnectedness in the world of the big dirty pond. And on that note, I leave you until next Wednesday. And I will put in the comments when the next one will be. Thank you so much.